They told me, quietly and with terrible certainty, that he shouldn't exist. They said it the way people say things at the edge of a crystal chandelier, delicately, as if the object would shatter if spoken of loudly. I stood under one of those chandeliers that night, an oval of cut glass that threw refractions across the dining room like small guilty stars, feeling for the first time that my life had a measurable edge. I had always liked the word margin. It suggested a pleasant minimalism, a safe band between spectacle and ruin. I kept a small brass key in a porcelain dish by my back door, as if that too were a margin, a tiny instrument of custody for the household's smaller mysteries. I kept a ledger bound in blue leather on my desk, not because I needed to track every bill, but because writing things down made them less invasive. A ledger felt like an act of witness. I tell you this so you'll know the scale of the small things. Wealth teaches ritual, signatures, receipts, a certain choreography of apology and purchase. It trades urgency for an appearance of control. The ledger mattered because it turned memory into proof and proof into structure. When the photograph came, folded and anonymous, it landed in that architecture, the brass key, the ledger, the ritual of custody, and exposed the seams. The photograph was a single frame of my greenhouse at 02:13 a.m. A flash of moonlight on glass, a bench of potted succulents, the margin plant. An unassuming sprig I had kept on the north shelf because someone once told me it meant resilience. Leaning toward the humid lamp. Someone had taken it from an angle that meant there was a viewport in the house. Someone had looked in. Viewport is a vendor term for remote access to a camera or interface. Plain English. It's a window through which a third party can look at a camera feed. It does not itself mean anything about what was shared or why. A session token is the little string of code that proves a connection was made. Think of it as a digital autograph left on the doormat of a session. And a checksum is the fingerprint a file leaves behind. A way to say, this exact file hasn't been changed since we sealed it. When Harini later sent me a glossary, handwritten, because that is how she made technical things feel manageable, she drew tiny boxes around each definition like they were keepsakes. I was on a refuge week when it happened. I had told people I had gone for the lights. I lied. I went to hide in order, to sleep in compartments of my life that I thought were inviolable. The house was smaller to me than it used to be. A series of rooms that had names and attendants. Rosa, who ran the household. Marco, who kept a log of the neighborhood patrols and the service vans that passed by. Harini, who knew where to put a hard drive where light could not reach it. Ross, who could make a subpoena look like a love letter. Useful, patient, necessary. I remember the ping on my phone. At first, I thought it was an app update. Then, it was an image. The greenhouse looked back at me in a way it shouldn't have. There was a single scrap of paper folded into the photo. A word I couldn't read without feeling the photograph's malice. I held the phone in my hand and the chandelier's light made bars across my palm. I did not scream. I wrote it down. That was our first rule. We did not leap. We documented. Documentation was not sentimental. It was protection. Rosa made a paper trail. She logged the receipt of the file, wrote a description at the top of a fresh ledger page, dated it, and signed it. Signatures mattered because they were the ritualized assumption of responsibility. A ledger entry read, photograph received via unknown sender, timestamp of image, Joe 2.13, location, greenhouse, initial custody, Rosa. It was small and mechanical, but it anchored the event to human hands. Rosa traced the paper with neat, careful fingers and said, with that quiet economy she used for household crises, we seal this, we duplicate, we wait for Harini. Rosa's hands were steady. She had a way of thinking in boxes that kept other people's panic at bay. That day she sealed the note and put it into an envelope, initialed it, and placed it beside the brass key. The key sat in its dish like a witness. I called Harini. She arrived with a laptop in a simple black case, and an expression that betrayed neither curiosity nor alarm, only a procedural focus that calmed me more than anything else. Harini's work is austere in a way that feels like prayer. She carries backups like sacred objects. She explained, in measured language and then in plain English, what she would do. First, she said, we air-gap. Air-gapped drive, plain English, A hard drive disconnected from the internet to prevent any further contamination or remote tampering. You take the data off the network, put it into a device that has no cables to the outside, and you make it impossible for anyone to reach in. It's literal cord cutting for data. Harini unlatched the case, removed a drive, and placed it like a living thing into a padded box. She wrote the date and time on a label with a tidy hand and affixed it. Then, we checksum, she told me. She typed commands into the laptop. The checksum verifies that the file you have is the same file that was originally captured. It is a way to say, this is the exact same photograph as when I first saw it. No more and no less. She printed out the checksum and signed the printout. She then duplicated the drive, 2 copies, and placed one into a sealed envelope with the original receipt, and the other into a tamper-evident bag that would go to an off-site vault. Chain of custody, plain English, the story of who had the evidence and when. You list the actors, Rosa, Harini, me, the dates, the times, and any transfer of the item. It's not glamour. It's the point at which something becomes prosecutable or unusable. The ledger recorded each of these steps. It had columns, item, source, action, signature, notes. We used initials like some secret society, RP, HK, ML, and the brass keys imprint on the dish. There was more than the photograph. The house's vendor dashboard, the interface our service providers use to manage camera access, showed an access event at 0213. The vendor's logs reported a session token and an IP address that had touched the camera's stream. Ross later described those items to me like ingredients in a recipe. Session token, IP address, vendor invoice line. He called them traces and said that together they formed a pattern, but he warned me about the difference between correlation and proof. He was careful to say pattern and not proof in that clipped, lawyerly way. Dante Moretti came that evening as if summoned by soft light. Dante had been present in the background of my life for longer than I cared to admit. He was a fixer by disposition and history, the kind of man whose name traveled in firm handshakes and hushed phone calls. He had once guarded my exit from a bad conversation with a photographer whose appetite outlasted consent. He was the person you called when you wanted a problem moved out of sight. He sat in the dining room under the chandelier and looked at the ledger as if it were a menu. After some minutes of coffee and the only silence that matters, where the room agreed not to make assumptions, Dante admitted, without flourish, that he had initiated a single viewport weeks earlier. Not this feed, he said. Not at 0213. I touched a camera to check on a delivery and then closed it. His voice was casual in the way that people make confessions when they expect forgiveness. He did not explain why. He did not explain to whom he had given access or whether he had intended any harm. Ross, who had joined us by phone, said we needed a written account. Dante reached into his coat and wrote with an acute, apologetic neatness. I initiated an access on indefinido. He signed with his full name. The ledger swallowed the admission. The admission did not make the photograph less invasive. It made it smaller and more accountable. Dante's signature sat beneath Rosa's and Harini's with the same weight. He agreed to oversight and remediation funds, terms we spelled out in Roman letters, practical and non-performative. The more ritualized the remedy, the less room there is for something to be smoothed away under the weight of courtliness. Dante handed over a check, optically modest, to fund technical remediation. He did not, and we did not, equate that with guilt. The ledger grew. We then learned what an invoice can hide. Vendors don't always itemize intuitively. Ross sat with a magnifying light, screening invoices, and he found a line item that made all of us hush. An ambiguous payment described as dependent support, indefinido. The characters associated with the entry were not names. They were account codes, strings of numbers and aliases. The entry had a date, an amount, and no further annotation. The presence of such a line in a vendor's billing is not, on its face, nefarious. It is an accounting clue. We framed it in the ledger as a lead, not as accusation. A ledger line suggested a dependent, I wrote, with the exact caution the sentence requires. Suggested, unverified, indefinido. That phrasing is the scaffold on which we built our next moves. We had to talk to the district attorney. Ross arranged the intake. We carried a packet, the photograph sealed in its envelope, the original checksum printout, the vendor's access log with session token, Dante's signed admission. the invoice with the mysterious dependent line. I remember the DA's assistant looking at the packet and setting it down like it was a tray of fragile glass. The deputy who took it, she had the calmness of a clerk accustomed to reading other people's lives, said plainly, "We have thresholds." She explained the thresholds in quiet language. There must be probable cause of a criminal act, or at least a pattern strong enough to suggest a crime beyond a single access. The photograph and the logs were a start. The invoice was interesting. Dante's admission complicated a narrative of anonymity, but it did not yet clear the bar for indictment. She spoke of disclosure and intent, and the difference between malicious distribution and an unwelcome look. She did not promise prosecution. She did, however, promise review. We left the intake with the understanding that public law could do only so much. The ledger, the documentation, and the chain of custody made our complaint visible to state actors, but visibility alone does not equal remedy. It can be a first step, but it is a long stair. The moral decision that occupied me most in those days was simple and terrible. To smooth was to privatize. To escalate was to risk exposing others. There is a pressure, social, whispered, practical, to resolve a violation quietly. I had been offered quiet resolutions before. Hush money, avoided names, a redecoration. The rituals of the wealthy sometimes hide aggression under the velvet of restitution. We had to choose between erasing the event from public view with money and measures that would only protect me, or transforming the private wrong into a public instrument that could help others. This is where margins began as not a plan, but as an argument. I did not want to be the woman who bought silence and called it closure. I wanted the ledger to become something more than a private artifact. If privacy was being auctioned off by intermediaries, vendors, purveyors of access, reputation firms, then preservation needed to be affordable, practical, and immediate for those without means. I sketched a structure that could take our initial costs and make them a public good. Before we acted, I spoke with Ela. She had come to me weeks prior at a luncheon where the food was small and the chairs soft. Her presence was plain and determined, and very private. She was someone who had been harmed by exposure economies, and who chose not to be erased in the way others sometimes wanted her to be. She agreed to be on a council we did not yet have a name for. "If you're going to do it," she said, "make space in the governance. No plaque, no titular head. Let the survivors steer." That sentence, "let the survivors steer," became a plank. I wrote it down and it became, in the ledger's margin, an instruction rather than an aspiration. We set out to transform a private ledger into legal architecture without turning the story into spectacle. That meant turning the ledger into a governance instrument. Ross drafted preliminary language for a preservation clause, emergency preservation requests to vendors, a legal intake form for survivors, a triage protocol to identify who needed immediate relocation assistance versus those who needed only technical preservation. The language was careful. We would not promise legal outcomes. We would promise process. We would fund air-gapped storage for critical evidence, rapid duplication, paid legal intake, and short-term housing when necessary. That is how a ledger, words on paper, a series of signatures, becomes law-like. An early piece of our plan was technical and vertical. We would set up a hotline and a vendor liaison. We would present the vendor with two things: a court-ready preservation request and an outsized moral pressure that came from being a named institution rather than a private complainant. Vendors respond differently to institutions. A corporation, even a privacy-averse one, has processes for dealing with a foundation than for dealing with an embarrassed individual. We intended to be a foundation. Lena, the journalist, was the person who would give the ledger wings. She came by the house with a notebook and a hard eye for pattern. Lena did not want to sensationalize. She wanted to map. She asked about session tokens and vendor invoices the way someone else might ask about family recipes. She traced the access logs across time and found small patterns that were not singular, but not yet systemic either. Strange overlaps in IP ranges, a handful of vendor accounts with recurring ambiguous line items. Her reporting would later describe this as a market invisibility, but in that first conversation we only had hints. We had one more reveal. While sorting through an old shipment manifest, a slip Rosa kept in a drawer under envelopes for utility bills, Marco, our security person, found a neighborhood log noting repeated maintenance visits at odd hours. It was the small detail that corroborates the small detail. Someone had accessed the property remotely. Someone had keys and codes and perhaps a sympathy for the margins. Marco was a methodical man. He presented his notes as if delivering a weather report. His logs would later align with vendor timestamps in ways that looked coordinated. For now, they were gestures. Lines that suggested traffic. Who had been where and when. There were people who wanted this smoothed. A friend called and said gently, "Just take the money. Move on." It was not a malicious suggestion. It was the way many practice damage control. Buy a redecoration, hire a whisper campaign, call it closure. I thought back to the brass key in its dish and the ledger's blue leather. A redecoration cannot preserve a file. It cannot preserve a name. It cannot give a survivor the evidence they need to tell their truth, should they ever choose to. Smoothing is a form of forgetting dressed up in silk. We made choices. We refused an immediate buy-off and instead set terms for remediation that were recorded in the ledger. Dante, who could have walked out and left us to the paperwork, insisted instead on being formally overseen. He signed an agreement acknowledging the breach of a service protocol and consenting to oversight and funds allocated to remediation. He did not admit criminality. He admitted access. His written acknowledgement was narrow in language. I initiated a limited camera access without prior authorization, and I regret the breach. He agreed to fund a technical audit and to accept an independent monitor for 6 months. His signature is in the ledger, and we filed a receipt for the funds. We then set into motion Harini's technical triage. She made duplicates, printed checksums, photographed the sealed envelopes, and recorded each movement. She created a digital ledger to mirror the physical one, with immutable timestamps. It was a ledger of ledgers, a paper book that explained the provenance of a digital file that itself held the image that had been taken. The chain of custody document included name, time, signature. The tech document included checksum, bit-for-bit copy, drive serial, and air-gapped storage location. Harini labeled boxes with a code that meant nothing to everyone but her and the archivists we planned to consult. We were not naive about the limits of process. The deputy at the DA's office had been clear that data and intent are different beasts. An IP address in a log is a thread, not a rope. Invoice notations can be placeholders. Dante's check did not equal admission of a crime. Yet the ledger, when kept rigorously, creates a public record that is not easily erased. If an institutional response is to be durable, it should not depend on outrage alone. It should be codified. There is a certain indignation in that codification. Indignation moved into procedure in the form of language. We included in the ledger a clause requiring donor restrictions. Money, if given, would come with legal cuffs. Donors could not require non-disparagement clauses that would silence survivors. Donors could not stipulate anonymity that would cut off public accountability. We learned fast that philanthropic attempts to help can also be tools of erasure. So the ledger included restrictions and contingencies, a mathematician's answer to moral hazards. At 3 a.m., when the city had reduced to hush and the chandelier's prisms were soft, I sat at my desk and wrote the ledger's next entry in longhand. It read in careful strokes. Decision point. Transform private harm into public resource for preservation. Immediate actions, air gap, checksum, DA intake, vendor preservation request, governance principle, survivor advisory control. I signed it. Rosa initialed. Harini stamped the page with a tiny inked seal that she used for authenticity. The brass key sat in the dish like a punctuation mark. I want to be clear about what we were not asking for. We were not asking the ledger to be an instrument of vengeance. We did not want to turn the house's intimacy into a trial of character. We were asking for architecture. Architecture can be as humble as a storage locker that is never online. It can be as ambitious as a nonprofit that litigates on behalf of those without means. Architecture, in the ledger's language, meant process. That night, before sleep, I thought of the plant margin on the greenhouse shelf. It had survived winters and neglect. It tilted toward light. In one of our small ceremonies, we repotted it and moved it to the north shelf so Harini could document it as part of the photograph's provenance. The plant's dirt came up in my hands like a future, messy, dark, and full of hidden things that nonetheless supported root growth. I wrote, aloud to myself, a line in the ledger that later would become more taut. If privacy is a commodity, we will make preservation a public good. We had assembled the pieces of a minimal public answer. Harini's air-gapped duplicates, Ross's preservation drafts, Rosa's logistical sovereignty, Marco's neighborhood logs, Dante's cash for remediation, and Lena's tentative mapping of vendor markets. The ledger began to look less like a private diary and more like a blueprint. Still, two things remained unsettled: the invoice line that suggested a dependent, indefinido, and the ways in which vendors might resist preservation requests. That resistance, we suspected, would not be legal theatrics, but bureaucratic attrition. A vendor might stonewall, ask for more documentation, demand a subpoena, or simply delay. Delay erases. We anticipated delay by building redundancy into the ledger. We created a fast lane for preservation, an emergency preservation request form that Harini and Ross could jointly sign, and that we could present to vendors as the action of an institution. We would pay for expedited copies and for secure storage. We would fund legal intake to ensure survivors had counsel to interpret the evidence. The ledger circled each of these measures in red. Before midnight had bled into morning, we tried the first preservation request. Ross drafted a letter to the vendor. In plain English, it asked for an immediate snapshot of the camera feed and an affirmative preservation of relevant logs. He attached the checksum printout so the vendor could see that the file in our hands had been confirmed and certified. The vendor replied with a form letter asking for a subpoena. It was exactly the kind of slow procedural obstruction we had feared. Lena visited the next day and asked me softly whether I had ever imagined my life reduced to logs and ledgers. I told her no. I told her I had imagined more garden parties, fewer forms. She looked at the ledger with a kind of journalist's recognition and asked whether I would publish the ledger entries. There we paused. The ledger's publicness was an ethical question. We could use it to pressure vendors and legislators, but disclosure could also re-traumatize those whose names appeared in the margins. Ella's voice, again, was the anchor. If you publish, she said, publish process, not pain. Publish the way to get help. Show the architecture. So we committed to a form of transparency that reduced personal detail and amplified procedural guidance. Show the steps the ledger required without making private harms into public spectacle. That commitment shaped our correspondence strategy. We would show the DA and legislators' process, supply anonymized data where necessary, reveal vendor patterns without exposing survivors' identities. We would push for vendor commitments to preservation protocols in exchange for the reduced friction that institutions enjoy. Lena, whose article would come later, took copious notes about process and about the subtleties of access. The ways small companies sold services that polished privacy into a commodity. The ways reputational firms patched reputations instead of addressing harm. 1 month into this ledger life, an audit firm accepted a brief engagement to review vendor preservation procedures. It was a modest win. The audit would not prosecute. It would produce a white paper recommending practical steps. Faster preservation windows, clearer APIs for preservation requests, an escrow for emergent evidence. We included the audit's letter in the ledger as if placing a jewel into a box. It was not a juridical victory, but a procedural one. It told us that small, cumulative changes could alter the market's incentives. Still, the invoice's dependent line waited like an unwritten footnote. It had suggested, no more, an unknown beneficiary associated with vendor billing. It had not been named. It had not been identified. The ledger entry read, Invoice anomaly. Dependent support. Indefinido. Action. Request vendor clarification. Status. Open. That phrase, indefinido, was a legal and moral cushion. It allowed us to pursue an avenue of inquiry without transforming a ledger line into an accusation. When we reached out to the vendor for clarification, their compliance team replied with a request for more documentation and a promise to review. That was the corporate equivalent of a nod. The vendor's reply was neither admission nor denial. It was, instead, an exercise in attrition. It meant we would have to turn the ledger's page again and again to the same question. There were 2 encounters with Dante after his written admission. In the first, he sat with us and outlined the delivery he had checked on, the camera he had accessed to confirm a driver, and the name of the vendor interface he had logged into. That line of detail confirmed a small fraction of the log. In the second encounter, he signed the oversight agreement and accepted the monitoring we set out. He did so without theatrics. We did not extract confessions. We took signatures, receipts, and assurances. Those particular negotiations were recorded in the ledger as two discrete transactions: admission of access, agreement to fund remediation, and subject to oversight. We did not pretend these things fixed everything. They did not. They made the event auditable. That is not the same thing as justice, but in an economy that commodifies exposure, auditable architecture can be an instrument for future accountability. On a gray afternoon, with rain pressing at the windows, I sat with Harini and Ross, and read aloud a draft of what the ledger's header might say if it were to become an institution. It began: margins, emergency preservation, legal intake, rapid relocation, survivor advisory governance. We read it aloud as if naming could call something into being. The ledger held the draft like a map that someone had just begun to draw in pencil. We blotted the page with careful notations: donor restrictions, survivor-led governance, audit clause, vendor liaison. Each clause was a small ritual of restraint against erasure. And then, in the ledger's margin, I made a note that would later be quoted and misquoted by other people as if it were a manifesto. We would not, in seeking remedy, become another private opulence disguised as charity. We would not close the door. We would open one. There is a modest and perhaps naive hope that the brass key in its dish and the ledger on my desk might be more themselves than instruments of performance. The brass key reminds me that access can be given and taken. The ledger reminds me that access can be tracked. The plant margin kept its head turned toward the lamp, unfazed by human quarrels. Roots are patient. So we closed the first chapter of the ledger. Air gap confirmed, checksum recorded, DA intake logged, invoice query filed, Dante's monies accepted with oversight. And then we paused, which is where the story must stop for now. The ledger's page was still open, the ink barely dry. The sun from the title existed in our records only as a ledger line, a suggestion, an item marked indefinido. It had no face, no corroborating testimony, no legal resolution. It was a fragment that raised questions about lineage, inheritance, secrecy. It pushed our work into a space beyond privacy, family, legacy, and the social economies that cherish appearance over truth. We had by then done what small things we could do without making others vulnerable in the process. We chose to convert betrayal into architecture. We moved from private smoothing to procedural design. In the ledger's language, we made a choice to found something that could outlast our own emotional cycles. A body that would preserve evidence, fund counsel, and provide immediate sanctuary. Outside, the city continued. The chic boutiques along the avenue polished glass without noticing ledger pages. Vendors updated interface versions and sent polite, circular emails. The photograph remained in its sealed envelope. Its checksum was taped to the back. The brass key rested in its dish. The plant margin leaned toward a strip of filtered light. The ledger's blue leather cover closed on that day's signatures. And when I set it aside, I felt the small, brittle peace of someone who had turned anxiety into procedure. We were not done. The invoice's dependent line lurked like a question. Vendors still resisted. The DA had the packet, but the packet did not guarantee law. There were two ways forward: to accept the comforts of a private settlement and sleep, or to push toward an architecture so plain and relentless in its procedures that it forced vendors and institutions to respond. I had already chosen. The ledger doesn't shout. It keeps a record and insists on being consulted. It demands signatures and attention. It is, in its blunt way, a moral instrument. It insists that someone be accountable not for the hurt alone, but for the steps that allow others to be protected. It is slow work. It is the opposite of spectacle. It is, in the end, a way of parenting a problem rather than passing it off. An odd paternalism that treats secrecy itself as the child that needs a guardian. I wrote one more line that night. Next, file for incorporation, draft bylaws with survivor advisory clause, solicit audit partnership, prepare public white paper with sanitized process steps for release. I underlined the words survivor advisory twice. When the ledger closed that night, I felt both lighter and more heavily burdened. We had acted with rigor and restraint, but the ledger had also become a commitment to continued work. Between the chandelier's light and the brass key's metal, the sun who shouldn't exist remained a ledger line. an indefinito presence that had the power to complicate inheritance, secrecy, and the politics of exposure. It hovered like a question mark. There would be more calls, more receipts, more visits from lawyers and auditors. There would be an article from Lena that turned our modest ledger into a public problem statement. There would be vendor pushback and perhaps grudging policy shifts. There would be new ledger entries, names, timestamps, checksums. For now, though, the ledger rested, the plant margin breathed, and the brass key sat in the dish like a small, faithful witness. The ledger's blue leather closed that night, and the house returned to its ordinary, careful breathing. But a ledger is not a shutter. It is a map insisting you keep moving. We had written the decisions down. Now we had to make them move in the world. The first motion outward was small and precise. Lena's piece. She had taken our anonymized materials and, with characteristic care, threaded them into a pattern that read beyond my dining room. Her article did not scream. It taught. It began with an image she borrowed from me, the brass key sitting in its dish, and widened into an analysis of how an assortment of vendors, interfaces, and intermediaries had created a market for access. She used our sanitized ledger extracts to show process rather than pain. The steps we had taken, the log lines that mattered, the ways vendors responded to institutional requests versus private pleas. When the article published, it landed like a polite but urgent knock. People who read it wrote to ask how to preserve evidence, to complain about vendor stonewalling, to say anonymously that they had been looked at in their bedrooms or their kitchens by feeds they never authorized. Press interest brought attention. Attention brought scrutiny. Scrutiny brought pressure on vendors who, until then, had treated preservation as an awkward side conversation. We had prepared for this in the ledger, a public white paper, sanitized and procedural, ready to make available the steps one might take when a camera feed is suspected of unauthorized access. Harini and Ross edited it into something deliberately non-sensational: checklists, sample preservation forms, a glossary, viewport, session token, checksum, air-gapped drive, and a model emergency preservation letter that could be used by council or a named institution. We released it the week Lena's article ran, in a manner that emphasized help more than rage. Ela insisted on that framing. She wanted survivors to see paths, not invitations to spectacle. The immediate effect was practical. A mid-sized vendor, one of the companies that had appeared in Lena's map of recurring but ambiguous billing entries, reached out to our council with an offer to pilot a preservation API. An API, for anyone not steeped in developer talk, is simply a set of rules that lets one piece of software speak to another. Plain English, it's a doorway you can open to ask a company to freeze and produce particular records without months of forms. Their initial proposal was clumsy, defensive, full of legal hedges. We pushed. Ross pushed harder. He insisted on timeline guarantees and on an auditable receipt for preservation actions, something that would generate, in the vendor's own systems, an immutable flag that the snapshot and the logs had been preserved. The vendor agreed to a limited pilot in exchange for technical guidance and a promise that we would publicize the results in a manner that did not expose individuals. Pilot is a small word for what felt like a kind of public experiment. We could not demand wholesale reform. What we could do was produce a template. The pilot would require the vendor to accept our emergency preservation request form and to produce a signed, time-stamped confirmation that included their internal reference numbers and a copy of any logs they preserved. Harini built the intake flow. Ross wrote the legal wrapper. Lena promised to observe without sensationalizing. The vendor assigned an engineer who answered in plain, apologetic paragraphs and a lawyer who answered in hedged clauses. We took it one step at a time. The other outward motion was legal. Ross filed a subpoena request in an effort to clarify the dependent support indefinito line that lingered in the invoice. He did so carefully, always emphasizing the ledger's provisional language: suggested, unverified, indefinito. A subpoena is a formal request from a court to produce documents. Plain English. It's the law asking you politely, and then more insistently, to open a drawer. The vendor pushed back. They claimed that their billing codes were proprietary, that releasing detailed annotations risked exposing commercial structures. Ross argued that what we sought was not trade secrets, but transparency into an entry that might indicate the movement of funds attributable to an account associated with unauthorized access. The court granted a limited order. produce metadata and annotations related to the billing line, redacting anything that touched on true trade secrets. What we got was a folder that read like a careful compromise. The annotations showed that the dependent support code was applied to a cluster of accounts over several months, sometimes associated with corporate caregiving services, sometimes attached to administrative fees, and sometimes, frustratingly, to an internal code used for third-party contractors. There was no neat smoking gun. There was, instead, a pattern of opacity. In one instance, a payment was routed through a shell vendor name, a carefully neutral phrase that meant nothing to the casual reader. That routing did not prove anything about intent, but it did show how transactions could be made to vanish into accounting categories. We recorded the production in the ledger and marked the line, invoice clarification, partial, leads, continue vendor audit, status, active. The DA's office continued their review in parallel. They called for additional logs, and the vendor, under the pressure of both Ross's subpoena and Lena's reporting, produced a fuller set of session metadata for the period around 0213. The deputy with whom we had first met explained, again in her quiet way, that what mattered to her prosecutors was proof of malicious distribution or an intention to expose. An unauthorized look, deeply violating as it was, did not always meet thresholds for criminal charges. Intent mattered, distribution mattered, pattern mattered. But within those thresholds, metadata could create a narrative of behavior. Our hope was not that the DA would produce a headline. Our hope was that the DA would see a pattern that would justify deeper civil inquiries and regulatory interest. The deputy promised review and put a file number on our packet. That file number lived in the ledger like a small talisman. At home, the ledger continued to work as a choreography of restraint. Donors reached out with offers that varied between the earnest and the performative. Some wanted to endow margins with large sums, but attached to generous restrictions, non-disparagement clauses, secrecy demands, or the right to appoint board members. The ledger's donor restrictions clause was not rhetorical. We turned down money attached to silencing. We accepted funds with legal cuffs that preserved our independence. No donor could insist on gagging survivors. No donor could demand that our intake procedures be contracted out to third-party reputation firms. Money would come with minimal strings, an audit clause that required our financials be public in aggregate, a clause that prevented advisory seats becoming honorary sin-eaters, and a strict prohibition on donor-mandated anonymization as a condition of funding. These were small, shame-free arithmetic exercises. Accept this gift, with these limitations, or do not accept it. The choice became a line in the ledger. Donor offers, terms negotiated, accepted. List entries, rejected. List, rationale, preserve survivor-driven governance. We incorporated margins as a legal entity on a gray Tuesday that smelled faintly of printer toner and wet leaves. Ross drafted bylaws that were at once juridical and moral. Survivor Advisory Council with binding vote on intake policy. A donor restriction clause written in plain legal English. An audit requirement every 12 months. A liaison clause obliging vendors to respond to our preservation requests within 24 hours for pilot cases. A narrow emergency relocation fund for immediate sanctuary. We filed articles of incorporation and bound the signatures into the ledger. The brass key rested in its dish as we signed the incorporation documents. Harini photographed the filings and wrote a checksum for the scanned PDF out of an almost superstitious desire for numbers to watch over numbers. The first board meeting was a modest thing. There were chairs, name cards, lukewarm coffee, and a sense of something being made real by the act of assembly. Ela sat at the head without theatrics. She insisted that the advisory council be more than consultation. She wanted veto power on cases where survivor safety might be compromised by publication. That clause made the corporate lawyers nervous. Ross negotiated language that balanced fiduciary duty with survivor control. The board voted to approve the budget, to hire a small staff, and to publish, within 90 days, a sanitized white paper on preservation protocol. The ledger recorded the votes, the dissenting notes, and the motion to adopt a code of ethics that forbade non-disparagement as a term of aid. Margin's first hire was a practical one. A veteran intake coordinator who had worked in crisis hotlines, and who knew how to move between empathy and forms. She became a human hinge. Her job was to receive calls, to triage them by immediate safety needs versus preservation needs, and to help survivors navigate the air gapping and the duplication process. Our intake form was intentionally minimal, enough to prioritize cases without forcing survivors into retelling their trauma. We practiced the process with a few volunteers who consented to be test cases. Harini and the intake coordinator ran through roll calls. Receive call, open case, initiate emergency preservation request, deploy funds for temporary relocation if requested, contact vendor liaison. Each step was coded into the ledger and given a response time target. We treated these targets as moral promises. The first real case under the margins umbrella came 3 months after incorporation. A woman, call her M for privacy, woke in the middle of a night to an email with a private link to a cloud folder. The link contained images taken at a time she did not remember consenting to. She called our hotline, voice shaking but determined. Our intake coordinator moved with practiced calm. We opened a case, we asked her to keep a device off networks, we guided her to turn her router off, and we initiated a preservation request under the pilot API with the vendor who had agreed to the experiment. Harini instructed the intake coordinator on a simple, crucial piece of advice. Do not sign anything with the vendor without counsel. Signatures, particularly in the fog of shock, could be misread as surrender. The vendor responded, under the pilot protocol, within 14 hours. They produced a signed preservation receipt that included their internal snapshot reference, the session token, the timestamp, and a copy of the preserved logs with redactions for non-essential identifiers. Harini verified the checksum and wrote the printout into the ledger. We paid for rapid duplication. Harini took the drive to the off-site vault. Ross set up a pro bono counsel call for M. The immediate victory was narrow. The images had been frozen and could not be erased without an auditable trail. That freezing gave an option. Counsel could evaluate options for takedowns, privacy suits, or preservation for future needs. It did not erase the harm. It did, however, give someone a choice and the technical means to pursue it. Small procedural victories accumulated into rhetorical weight. We published the sanitized white paper. We shared our model preservation letter and our vendor liaison code. Vendors, summoned by Lena's mapping and by the pilot's modest success, began to draft their own preservation protocols. One competitor to our pilot vendor announced a voluntary change. They would accept urgent preservation requests from a vetted list of institutions and would create in their interface a preservation flag that generated an auditable timestamp on their end. In plain terms, a company that once required a subpoena would now, for certain cases, accept a formal preservation request and document it. That was a bureaucratic improvement. It was not a revolution. But bureaucratic improvements are how systems change. Alongside those bureaucratic steps, we navigated the ledger's thorny familial clue. The vendor produced more annotations under subpoena, and one thread in the document trail suggested that the ambiguous dependent support code had been used, at least periodically, to route small recurring payments to an account that matched, in structure, if not in name, the pattern one would use to sustain a miner's expenses. The metadata did not provide a name. There were no corroborating social records in the production. We could not, and did not, transform that ledger line into a statement of fact. We continued to label it indefinido and to press for more information through civil discovery channels. Ross filed a targeted discovery motion to compel metadata related to the account linked with the billing code. The court granted it in part and denied it in part, instructing the parties to narrow the focus. What the discovery yielded was a series of redacted transactions and a name string that had been obscured. We recorded each production with the ledger's ritual: copy, checksum, signature, seal. The son, our titular son, remained a suggestion on the page, a question that bent the ledger toward family, inheritance, and the strange ways that secrets become financial flows. That ambiguity shaped conversations beyond the law. At a foundation convening on privacy policy, Lena framed the son, not as gossip, but as a symbol of what can happen when privacy is monetized. A hidden beneficiary, an invisible dependent, a human life that might be brokered without consent. In one of the convenings Margins hosted, a policy advisor listened, and then said something that became a plank in our outreach. When money moves through opaque strings, it can birth legacies that escape accountability. The advisor was careful with language. So were we. We did not allege paternity or name a person. We said instead, there was a ledger line that suggested a dependent, it was unverified. It raised policy questions about accountability in vendor billing and the necessity of transparency where personal effects of access are concerned. That framing allowed legislators and regulators to ask better questions without engaging in character assassination. Regulatory interest grew in measured increments. A city council committee requested our sanitized white paper and asked public comment. A privacy watchdog emailed to propose a joint study on vendor preservation windows and mandatory responses to emergency preservation requests. None of this was guaranteed reform. It was, at best, a slow accretion of attention. We submitted testimony at one hearing in which Ross and I spoke, carefully and plainly, about what a preservation window ought to be. A defined period during which vendors must preserve relevant logs and media upon receiving an urgent request, with clear channels for emergency judicial bypass when evidence was in imminent danger of deletion. The committee took our testimony and asked staff to draft language for a proposed ordinance that would study mandatory preservation policies for critical evidence. It was, again, a small procedural nudge rather than sweeping change, but that is often how institutional remapping begins. Within margins, governance work sharpened. The Survivor Advisory Council convened monthly and developed a consent rubric that prioritized autonomy and choice. Ella pushed for a clause granting survivors the ability to request that their cases remain sealed in our public materials. She also insisted on the right to escalate a case to a survivor emergency committee if publication choices risked harm. The council's votes became entries in the ledger: vote tallies, minutes, dissenting comments, and scholar-informed rationales. We added a confidentiality protocol for intake staff: what they could share internally, who could see metadata, and the circumstances under which a case could be anonymized in public documents. These were small, painful decisions. They trade instant transparency for durable survivor care. Dante's oversight period concluded 6 months after his signed agreement. We had an independent monitor do a compliance review and produce a brief. The monitor confirmed that Dante had met the terms. The remediation funds had been allocated, an audit of accesses he could account for had been completed, and the monitoring reports had been submitted on schedule. The monitor's report was careful and clinical. It did not pronounce moral absolution. It documented compliance. Dante came to the last review meeting as if it were a checkbox cleared. He did not make a speech. The ledger recorded the sequence as a transactional arc: admission, remediation fund allocated, audit completed, monitor report filed. That ordinality is what mattered to us. It created a trail, and trails are hard to erase. Months turned into a year. The ledger accumulated procedural successes: pilot preserved, vendor adoption of preservation flag, city staff study initiated, white paper published, survivor council installed, donor restrictions upheld. It also accumulated the slow ache of limits. The sun remained indefinido. The DA had not brought charges, and larger market structures that facilitate opacity still functioned. We documented both wins and lacunae with equal seriousness. There were moments of human quiet that felt like small epilogues. M wrote to say that, because evidence had been preserved, she had been able to secure a restraining order against a person who had been bothering her via messages. The restraining order was not a criminal conviction of distribution. It was an immediate, practical barrier that allowed her to sleep with fewer alarms. She thanked us for the cold, clinical thing that we had chosen to become. An institution that made evidence durable. Ella, who had been central to designing our consent rubric, hosted a small gathering where survivors shared, if they wished, the ways institutional architecture had changed how they made decisions. Someone brought a lemon tart. Someone else read a note. There was no triumphal music. There was, instead, the domestic texture of people making human sense of systems. The brass key, which had been a fixture and a witness, took on an institutional life beyond the dish. In one of our modest rituals, Harini's idea, we attached a tiny tag to the key when we filed incorporation paperwork. The tag read, "Margins Custody Protocol." It was a private joke about ironies, an object used to lock doors now attached to the idea of custody over records. The tag sat on the ledger's page during our first annual review. Harini took a photograph and archived it with a checksum. One afternoon, as the first spring after incorporation pressed into being, Lena called to say she had been invited to present at a conference on digital privacy. She asked if we would allow her to present the sanitized case study of Margin's pilot and our ledger-driven approach. We agreed. She presented the story not as scandal, but as infrastructure. How a ledger can be a constitutional act of care. The audience, mostly policymakers and privacy advocates, asked precise questions. Someone from a civil liberties nonprofit asked whether margins would share our intake templates. We said yes. Someone from a consumer tribunal asked whether we had costed the emergency preservation pipeline. We said yes, and offered our figures in aggregate. The conversation ballooned outward, as these things do, into a network of interest and cautious partnership. Throughout this public movement, we remained careful about language. The Sun, in every public document, remained a ledger notation, indefinido. We debated whether to mention him at all in public materials. Sometimes anonymity is protection. Sometimes anonymity hides facts. The board decided to treat him as a lead that required continued inquiry, but no public naming. We would, in our filings and in our public documents, say, a ledger line suggested a dependent. This is unverified. Ongoing civil discovery seeks clarification. That careful phrasing allowed us to press administrative levers without performing family drama on the front pages. There is a particular cruelty to ambiguity. It demands that you live with a question in your chest. The Sun was one such question. At times it felt like a cipher for a private guilt I had not had language for. The felt pressure of legacy. The knowledge that appearances can hide costs. At other moments it was a policy puzzle. How might vendor billing cultures create the ability for dependents to be sustained in invisible accounts? And what would transparency mean? We treated that ambiguity as a vector for work, rather than a story to be told at cocktail parties. The ledger kept collecting. A national non-profit asked to replicate our model in another city. We sent our sanitized materials and our intake checklist. An audit firm we had contracted produced the white paper Lena had promised would land in policy circles. Recommendations for preservation APIs, model retention windows, and a legal appendix outlining emergency judicial bypass procedures. The white paper was not law. It was an argument. Lawmakers sometimes take advice. Sometimes they do not. In a regulatory hearing, one council member asked bluntly whether such a preservation requirement would impose undue costs on small vendors. Harini, who had anticipated the objection, replied that the demands we were making in the model were minimal, and that the infrastructure for snapshotting a feed existed already in most vendor backends. It was a matter of documentation and small developer work. The council member nodded, not convinced, and asked staff to cost the proposal. The ledger recorded the exchange. Policy engagement. Ongoing. Staff analysis requested. All of this work had a cost, not only in money, but in attention. There were days when the ledger felt like an instrument of anxiety. Every line a worry, every signature a new duty. There were nights when I wondered whether we had made something noble, or merely another bureaucracy. On a rainy evening, Ella and I walked through the greenhouse and repotted the margin plant again, smoothing new soil around its roots. The plant, like our institution, had been moved and relocated, handled with a gardener's care. Ella said quietly, "You have parented something that will have to be parented in turn." She meant it as a consolation and a warning. Institutions need stewardship. They can be good parents or careless ones. The Sun question shifted subtly over time from a potential family scandal toward a policy metonym. When Lena later wrote a reflection on the project, she used him as a rhetorical figure. A way to discuss hidden dependence and the ethical dimensions of vendor accounting. She did not give him a face. She did not name anyone. She used the ledger to argue that markets that invisibilize human effects make it easier for certain kinds of harms to metastasize. That framing reached a legislator who introduced language in a related bill proposing that digital service vendors maintain clearer annotations on billing entries when they relate to third-party services that could have personal effects. The bill was modest, technical, and likely to be amended. It was, nonetheless, an example of how a ledger line can catalyze conversation in unexpected places. We learned that publicness is a tool with both edges. Lena's reporting had raised the profile of our work and pushed vendors to negotiate pilot contracts quickly. It had also brought opportunists, small-time litigators who specialized in internet breach suits, and who reached out offering to sue on behalf of unnamed parties. We declined to litigate for spectacle. The ledger's ethics were clear: preserve, support, and let survivors choose next steps. We would not manufacture plaintiffs for the sake of headlines. That decision lost us some friends among the more litigious crowd, but it kept our work anchored to survivor agency rather than spectacle. A year after the first photograph, we convened a modest public forum to share our sanitized white paper and to describe the results of the pilot. There were 3 panelists from Margins, Harini, Ross, and me, plus Lena, and a representative from the vendor who had participated in the pilot. The room was small because our ethos was not to perform for breadth but to build for depth. We presented the numbers: pilot requests received, preservation flags engaged, median time to preservation, number of cases where immediate counsel was facilitated because data was preserved. We did not claim miracles. We described outcomes in plain arithmetic. In 4 cases, preservation enabled counsel to secure temporary protective orders. In 2 cases, preservation prevented immediate deletion of content. In 1 case, preservation did not change the legal horizon, but permitted the survivor to retain options for civil action later. We published these numbers in aggregate with consistent anonymization. The vendor rep acknowledged the friction they had felt with our early requests and proposed to formalize a preservation pathway for vetted institutions. The vendor's lawyer used careful language: compliance, privacy, burden. But the technical rep displayed a mock-up of the preservation API flag that would now be rolled into a future release. It was not a grand gesture. It was a product roadmap that might, in time, alter the default response of platforms when confronted with urgent preservation needs. We recorded the vendor's commitment in the ledger and scheduled a technical workshop. Dante's public profile receded, as public profiles tend to when someone has paid a remediation fund and accepted oversight. He continued to run errands and offer his old Socialite services with an opt-in for oversight. He gave no interviews. He sent, in a handwritten note, a brief apology that we filed away with the ledger as part of the record. His remorse was practical: funds, oversight, and the willingness to be audited. That sufficed for the ledger, which is not the place for absolution but for accountability. There were moments when the ledger's slow work colluded with a different kind of beauty. Harini, who kept her work lean and ritualized, created an archive of the ledger itself: scans, checksums, and a public-facing page that explained, in sanitized form, what we did and why. That page offered templates to survivors: how to request preservation, how to store a drive air-gapped, what a checksum meant and why it mattered. We included links to low-cost legal services and to partner organizations who could assist with relocation. The page was less an advertisement than a field guide. Small boxes of information to help someone in a moment of crisis. We included, as Ela had insisted, survivor stories only with explicit consent and always sanitized for the public. Over time, others began to adopt parts of our model. A university clinic in another state asked for our intake form and adapted it for students. A regional bar association offered pro bono clinics for people who had held preserved evidence and wanted to know their options. These ripples were not the same as national law, but they were the seams by which culture changes. The journalistic and policy attention had, oddly, the quality of a mantle clock: persistent, reliable, and slow. Lena's follow-up pieces documented how vendors updated their interfaces and how some municipal bodies began to study preservation requirements. There was no federal bill that changed everything overnight. There were no sweeping indictments. That was by design. Our aim had never been spectacle. Our aim had been to change practice in small but meaningful ways. And still the ledger held the indefinido line, a shorthand for questions about family and secrecy. Ross continued to prod on the civil discovery front. The vendor kept producing redacted records. In one limited production there appeared a slightly more detailed annotation, a reference to minor support in a ledger field that had previously been coded more generically. The phrase did not name a person. It did not prove a relationship. It suggested a transactional arc consistent with supporting a dependent. Ross wrote in the ledger: invoice clarification, partial improvement. Notation suggests recurring minor support annotation. Action, subpoena for associated accounts. Status, active. We proceeded, not toward accusation, but toward clarification. That restraint came to define us. Margins became, in the small civic niche we occupied, a place people could call when they needed to stop the erasure of evidence. We funded modest legal support. We paid for secure storage. We advised on emergency relocation, and we pressed for public goods. APIs and preservation flags, not revenge. The brass key stayed in the dish. The plant margin continued to lean toward the lamp. The ledger did something else for me. It taught a new grammar of indignation. Indignation had once been a private heat that invited loud statements and performative horror. The ledger converted that heat into a civic discipline. It taught me to ask, what is the next institutional step that will give someone options? How do we make sure the person in crisis has evidence preserved without exploiting their pain for a headline? How do we structure donations so they do not become shackles? These questions turned anger into architecture. On the day we hosted our first survivorship convening, survivors from different walks of life joined the table, some by video to protect anonymity. Ela chaired the session with the fierce practicality that had guided her from the start. We spoke, not about my chandelier's light, but about protocols. How to store evidence. How to seek counsel without being re-traumatized by the process. How to make preservation accessible to people without resources. We set out metrics: average response time for preservation requests under the pilot, percentage of preservation flags engaged, number of survivors aided with relocation. These metrics were modest but necessary. They gave us a real sense of impact. The ledger's final pages in that year's bookend were hopeful in a tempered way. We recorded the vendor who committed to a preservation flag, the audit firm's recommendations accepted for study, the city staff report requested, and the one small legal outcome that mattered, a civil discovery meander that had produced, at least in administrative language, clarity about an account's annotation. It was clarity without identity. An improvement that might be net positive in policy terms, because it illuminated how billing codes could mask personal effects. The ledger's ink dried on those pages, and I felt the familiar double weight, lightened by action, heavy with pending questions. There is a word used by Harini with a smile in the greenhouse one afternoon that I like to borrow: stewardship. It is not grand, it is a practiced attentiveness. Margins was an act of stewardship, over evidence, over donor commitments, over survivor agency. It was also a confession that institutions require tending, that the work of protecting privacy cannot be reduced to a single check written in haste. The brass key continued to be a small witness. We moved at once to the Foundation's safe when we launched our first public education series. Someone joked that the key had been promoted. The joke landed without need for chuckles. The plant margin, which had been repotted 3 times now, occupied a corner of our modest office. We took photographs, checksummed the images, and filed them as part of a ritual that had become more concrete than ceremony. Proof preserved and made small. And the son, our titular son, remained in the ledger as a line that suggested human complication without demanding a story it had no right to invent. He had become, increasingly, a symbol for the kinds of questions that digitized opacity can raise. Questions about lineage, accountability, and what happens when money and access intersect in ways that render lives invisible. We treated that ledger line with the care of a librarian who has found a fragment, not a novelist who has found a plot. There were evenings when I sat at my desk with the ledger open and the brass key in its dish, and felt the strange consolation of ordinary forms. The ledger's ink is not dramatic. It requires patience and signatures. It requires the habit of documenting. That is how one turns bewilderment into a protocol that can be replicated beyond one house, beyond one person. If the photograph in the greenhouse had been a single act of looking, the ledger became a way to ensure that looking did not erase possibility. When the first anniversary of the photograph arrived, we held a small, private meeting. We did not make it a public anniversary. It felt too close to regret for that. Instead, we invited the people who had been most instrumental. Rosa, who had kept the physical rituals. Harini, who had taught us to distrust the network and respect the air gap. Ross, who had written subpoenas that felt like carefully folded papers of civic intent. Marco, who kept the neighborhood logs. Lena, who had given the ledger wings. Dante, who had submitted to oversight. And Ayla, who had refused to be a footnote. We read the ledger aloud in the parts where we had recorded decisions and outcomes, and we listened to the pragmatic music of our own signatures. At the end of that reading, in the quiet that followed, I wrote a final line for that year's ledger entry. Margins operationalized. Preservation pilot launched. Vendor commitments. Partial. Policy engagement. Ongoing. Survivor advisory functioning. Donor restrictions enforced. Dependent support line. Indefinido. Continue inquiry. I then added what may have been sentimental but which I felt necessary. Margin plant repotted, brass key tagged, ledger sealed for annual archive. It did not feel like closure. It felt like a pause between breaths. The work of margins was not to end harm, but to reduce the capacity for erasure, and to provide choices when harm had been done. We had converted a personal violation into institutional practice. We had refused to smooth it over with silk, and instead spent that silk, bad metaphor but apt, on sewing stitches into civic fabric. The ledger's last entry that evening was a small, precise instruction. Public materials to include sanitized process checklists and resource links. Staff to be trained on trauma-informed intake. Vendor technical workshop scheduled. Continue civil discovery. Maintain donor restriction protocol. I signed it. Harini sealed the envelope with a practiced stamp. Rosa put the sealed envelope beside the brass key. The plant margin, in its new pot, tilted toward the window like a creature grateful for enough light. If someone asks now whether anything dramatic happened, if there was a single night of legal vindication or a dramatic arrest, I will say, plainly, no. There were no sweeping indictments. The DA reviewed, the vendors negotiated, policy began to shift in increments. That was always the point. The ledger's moral was institutional, to make provision, to preserve options, to insist on auditable steps. For some people that may sound bureaucratic. For others, like the survivors who called late at night to say thank you for preserving evidence that let them sleep, it sounded like mercy. They had told me, at the beginning, that he shouldn't exist. He existed at best, as a ledger line marked indefinido, a fragment that made us ask about lineage and secrecy. We never forced that fragment into a narrative that had no corroboration. We instead let it push us toward policy, toward a pilot that froze images, toward an emergency protocol that a frightened person could trust. We turned a private breach into a public instrument. The chandelier in the dining room still threw small guilty stars across the table now and then. The brass key sits in its dish. The ledger rests in its blue leather. The plant margin leans, patient and unremarkable, toward light. Margins, the foundation, continues to work in small rooms with large hopes, preserving evidence, funding counsel when it is needed, advising survivors, nudging vendors to document their work. If you want to learn more, the ledger's last public page, our sanitized white paper, remains available with resources and contact information. We list, plainly, how to request preservation assistance and where to find legal help. Links in the description include emergency preservation and survivor support resources. We did not cure the economy of exposure. We did not banish opacity from every billing table. But we made a small, durable claim. That access without consent deserves to be recorded, that evidence can be made auditable, and that survivors should not have to buy their own memory. The ledger teaches a modest grammar of care. Sign, date, duplicate, checksum, seal. Repeat. I close now, not with a promise of finality, but with a ledgered decision. Continue. The brass key rests. The plant margin breathes. The line that suggested a sun sits in the ledger as indefinido, a question that will require more legal light and institutional patience if it is to be answered. For now, the work is to parent an architecture that refuses to let such questions be smoothed away. If you find yourself looking for help, the resources below will point the way. If you can, share this quietly with someone who might need it. Support margins. If you believe institutions should learn to keep records that protect people rather than erase them, we are, in the ledger's language, a modest instrument, slow, procedural, and stubbornly hopeful.